Lyndon B. Johnson was one of the most controversial U.S. presidents of modern time. He fought for more African American equality than any president since Abraham Lincoln, and sought to use the nation's wealth to eradicate poverty. There was still tension regarding the civil rights of African Americans, but commentator James Reston observed that Johnson on the race problem had been the most effective mediator in Congress between the North and South. Johnson hoped to win the Democratic nomination for president in 1960, but his dreams were crushed by John F. Kennedy. After Kennedy won the first ballot, he offered the spot of vice president to Johnson. Years later, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson assumed office. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, housing, and jobs. It also increased federal power to prosecute civil rights abuses. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax in federal elections. However, many challenges still lay ahead for completely eradicating discrimination once and for all. Between 1964 and 1968, more than 100 riots occurred in various major American cities. The incident in Los Angeles in 1965 and Detroit in 1967 proved to have the worst aftermath, with Detroit receiving 43 casualties and property damage worth over $40 million. Just days after signing the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed a literacy test that had been used to prevent African Americans from voting, one of the worst race riots erupted in the streets of the predominantly African American neighborhood called Watts. There were 34 casualties and property destruction worth over $200 million that resulted from this riot. From the beginning of his presidency, Johnson worked tirelessly to create his vision of the Great Society. Johnson began working to secure passage of a number of important programs and bills in 1965, such as Medicare, a system of health insurance for elderly under the Social Security program, and many more. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided more than $1 billion in federal aid to help public schools pay for textbooks and new materials for their library. This was one of the earliest federal aid packages for education in the nation's history. The Higher Education Act funded scholarships and low-interest loans for students in college. As part of Johnson's War on Poverty program, Congress increased unemployment benefits, expanded the food stamp program, created new youth employment opportunities, and special preschool classes to underprivileged children. These programs amounted to the most ambitious attempt at liberal reform since the New Deal. In 1966, Thurgood Marshall was sworn into office as the first Black Supreme Court justice. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was a turning point in the civil rights movement. This specific act abolished discrimination in housing. The number of African Americans who went to high school and finished college increased significantly, leading to better jobs and business opportunities. Civil rights did not only involve equality, but it also gave African Americans a boost in their racial pride. We can thank Martin Luther King Jr., who dedicated his life to gaining these rights for his people. Working tirelessly to provide equal rights for all races, King used methods of compassion and nonviolence to make a statement, sparking a huge change in American society. King's most famous act as leader in the civil rights movement was during the March on Washington, where he delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Apollo 11, launched in 1969, was one of the most groundbreaking events that took place in the 60s. Broadcasted live on TV to a worldwide audience, Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and described the event as one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. In 1970, the census counted over 200 million people living in the United States for the first time.
One of the most traumatic periods in U.S. history, lasting more than a decade, was the Vietnam War. The U.S.'s defeat was costly in lives and money and tarnished Americans' reputation of freedom and liberty. JFK was trying to keep the U.S. out of the war while simultaneously increasing the number of military advisors in Vietnam. His oversight was abruptly cut short when he was assassinated. Johnson had received a mandate for his progressive ideas and for keeping the United States out of the Vietnam War. Johnson promised to be the keeper of his people and policies, but shortly after becoming president, an incident occurred that brought the United States ground forces into conflict in Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which were two incidents in which a U.S. ship and North Vietnamese torpedo boats exchanged shots and served as a pretext to the entry of the United States into the war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave congressional approval for the expansion of the Vietnam War. Though he feared the public would not be supportive, he saw this as necessary to repel any armed attack against the forces of the U.S. and to prevent further aggression. Despite Johnson's attempt to end communist aggression, fighting continued. When Nixon took over, he had the idea of a Vietnamization plan, which is the replacement of American troops with South Vietnamese troops to transfer military responsibility to Vietnam. Books often reflect a society's most pressing concerns. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee was published in 1960, becoming immediately successful due to its theme of social inequality. In 1966, The Valley of Dolls by Jacqueline Susan was published. It was instantly dubbed a classic for the incorporation of social concerns. However, books were on their way out as television became more popular. By the end of the 60s, about 95% of the homes owned at least one. Mid-decade, color television was introduced. The Monkees, The Brady Bunch, Gilligan's Island, The Flintstones, and many more shows entertained American families every night. The movie industry peaked in 1964 with the release of 502 films. Due to the new colored films, drive-in movie theaters popped up all across the nation. In 1964, Julie Andrews starred in the major motion picture Mary Poppins and won the Academy Award for Best Actress. This movie brought awe and magic to the big screens, introducing a new kind of filmmaking. Then, in 1965, she received her second Academy Award nomination for The Sound of Music and won Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Musical. In the mid-60s, music acts from the UK, along with other aspects of British culture, arrived in the United States. This phenomena is known as a British invasion. The Rolling Stones, The Who, The Grateful Dead, and of course, the Beatles. The Beatles' arrival at the JFK airport was a huge deal and attracted a crowd of about 5,000 teenagers and adults alike who came just to catch a glimpse of the talented group. This kind of crowd for a musical group had never been seen before. Making their first live appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, the Beatles played for about 20 minutes. 1,459 tickets were sold out of the 50,000 that were requested. The age of the hippie is often defined as the time when young adults with long hair, flowy pants, and tie-dye shirts caused a political, social, and cultural change, referred to as counterculture in America. They're known to possess core beliefs revolving around the values of peace and love, and they are oftentimes associated with nonviolent, anti-governmental groups. Protecting the environment was another big issue the hippies had focused on. Americans celebrated the first Earth Day in 1970. Many rock movements, poets, artists, and writers from the 1960s to today have been associated with this movement, most prominently the Grateful Dead, Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, and John Lennon.